Dr. Carr has published high-impact research on why residents in Detroit, Michigan turn down the offer of free trees and how to enact more fair and equitable approaches to community engagement in urban forestry. She has consulted with numerous nonprofit environmental groups and government agencies on ways to enhance multicultural partnerships, particularly in urban forestry, parks, and green space management. Outstanding contributions to the urban forestry profession. As a researcher, author, and educator, Dr. Carmichael received the 2022 honorary membership in the Society of Municipal Arborists. Her consulting work has included development and facilitation of a nationwide environmental justice training series for the Arbor Day Foundation, as well as trainings and workshops for organizations such as Forest Relief in Missouri, Speak for the Trees, Boston, Community Greening in Florida, and Trees for Honolulu's Future. She has also served as an equity and community engagement consultant for urban forest plans in Oakland, California, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Holyoke, Massachusetts. Thank you so much, Christine, for being here.
Thank you so much, Jayla. Yeah, it was a lot of stuff to hear. Thank you so much. So this is just a little bit about me. This is a picture of me in Detroit with a tree planting group. And this is about 10 years ago. So I did my PhD at Michigan State from about 2012 until 2017. So this was in the middle of my field work. And then since then, I've done a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Vermont, but I started my business in 2019. And that's when I've been able to do a lot more application of the lessons. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is what came out of this research in Detroit and how does it apply to other places, including Tacoma. And then how do we take this information and make changes moving forward to be fair and equitable in our urban forestry programs. So I did want to share a little bit. So I published this book. It's called Racist Roots: How Racism Has Affected Trees and People in Our Cities and What We Can Do About It. I published it in January of 2024. Things have obviously changed quite a bit since then. And I just wanted to share something from the book because I think that even though a lot has changed since this was published, there's a lot of key lessons that are still the same. And so I wanted to just kind of start the conversation with this quote from the book. So the work of changing directions away from institutional and systemic racism, which segregates and treats people differently based on race, involves going through uncomfortable but ultimately liberating practices, like listening to the painful experiences that people have gone through because of systemic racism. It's uncomfortable to hear these things, I believe, because it triggers feelings of guilt and sadness that cannot be easily remedied. By withstanding the discomfort in these moments, however, you can find ways to change the system to be fair and just. You are, in fact, already starting to do the work of moving away from systemic racism by choosing not to run away from the discomfort, but to learn from it. So this is something that really, I think, speaks to my approach to all of this work of directly acknowledging things like redlining, which we're going to talk about, which is what I'm referring to in the title of the book. We have this legacy of systemic racism, and we're going to see why that's so important to acknowledge, both so that we understand where we should prioritize the work now, and we can understand what are the best ways to engage with communities that have gone through this legacy. So a lot of lessons from Detroit, my work in Detroit and other cities are in this book. So if you'd like a signed copy, you're welcome to email me. And also there's going to be points throughout the presentation where I'll share places that you can find additional information in the book. So if you want to kind of explore things in greater depth. But I'm really hoping that today we can take this opportunity to have this important conversation about what does racism look like and discrimination in the context of urban and community forestry, and how can we fix these things moving forward and do a better job, ultimately for both the benefit of the environment, improving the tree canopy, as well as the social fabric of a community, because the two are really interconnected. So just to share a quick little agenda, we did the introductions. I'm going to share a brief history about racism linked to urban trees. And then we're going to get into an activity where you can reflect on what's called your heritage narratives, which are basically your community histories that you have. And it includes your relationship with your trees around you. And we're going to have a discussion about that, lessons learned, because it's really important as we have these conversations to acknowledge where we are coming from as individuals so that we can adequately hold space for other people who have different maybe experiences sometimes than us. But we all need to work together and respect where we're coming from. And then there's going to be a worksheet that I'll share with you about identifying and naming what are the barriers that are getting in the way and how can we overcome them. So I can share some things from other cities, and I would love it if you all would be able to share as well some of your thoughts and ideas and strategies. And then we'll have closing comments and next steps. But I do want to just acknowledge, I know probably if you saw the worksheets that were sent out ahead of time, it may have been overwhelming. It's a lot to consider. So I just want to acknowledge that today's conversation is one step, right, in your journey to fair forests. That's what I think about is the future we're trying to get to is fair forests, where everyone can benefit from trees in cities and feel involved. So we're not going to solve every problem tonight or today, and that's okay. But the goal is really to help empower you through this discussion and through the activities and information so that you feel equipped to take the next steps and you feel like it's approachable to you, and you have an intention and a strategy behind what you're doing. And at any point, if you want to ask questions, please feel free to use the chat. And Adela and Jayla, if you're monitoring the chat while I'm presenting and something comes up, feel free to interrupt me. There's also, I think, a raise hand feature. And yeah, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. I appreciate learning more about you all, and I appreciate you sharing that. So I did want to just kind of get to a brief overview. This is not going to be a long lecture or anything, but I do think it's important to just share some foundational information. Much of it maybe you have already been aware of or heard of, but it sets the stage for what are we going to do now. So this is a great image from American forests. You can see it's a leaf, but it shows far fewer trees on one side of the city compared to the other. And so there is this legacy we need to be aware of, that there is a disparity across the United States in urban tree canopy specifically. And this is something I get into a lot in chapter 1 of the book. But essentially, from the mid 2020s, like in the last 5 years, we've really gotten more studies showing us that low income blocks, in one example here, have less tree cover and have hotter average temperatures than high income blocks. So that's one element, is income. And the quote is very telling. The amount of greenery on your street depends on the amount of green in your pockets, according to a new study. This is a really useful image that shows the stark difference. So these are from satellite images overhead of canopy in median income is much lower on the left side compared to the right side. As you can see, this is across the United States. Portland, Oregon, which is probably the closest to where you all are, when the median income is around 40,000, there's very little tree cover. But if the median income is 160,000, it's a lot more green and covered with trees. So in 92% of urbanized areas studied, the low-income blocks have less tree cover. So that's pretty clear that that's a trend. And on average, the low-income blocks have 15% less tree cover and are 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit hotter. But this can obviously vary as well, depending on what the actual temperature outside is. And there's some additional information here about why this is the case. And so this is where race gets into the discussion. It's not just income, there's also a racial component. So redlining was a policy in the 1930s where the federal government, it was right after the Great Depression, they wanted to help families get access to affordable like rates for mortgages and buy homes. So they had created the Homeowners Loan Corporation and sent out surveyors across the United States to rate neighborhoods based on how desirable they were for mortgage lenders to invest in. And so it went from green being the best, blue still desirable, yellow definitely declining, and red was hazardous. So this is where the term redlining comes from. And the key issue here is that low ratings were largely determined by race and ethnicity. There's actually some really disturbing quotes, which I include in the book, from surveyors that say that they have surveyed the neighborhoods, and they will say acknowledge, if that the neighborhood is better kept in one area actually than another, but because all the residents are primarily people of color, they're going to mark it as a hazard, even though the area is very well cared for. And so this was very clearly racist. And so as a result, we see these studies, again, this is the last 5 years or so, which is kind of why getting all the Inflation Reduction Act funding for urban and community forestry was so exciting, because we knew where the work needed to happen the most. And we still do. We need to keep this in the forefront of our minds. So you can see in these heat discrepancies, this is between redline neighborhoods and higher rated neighborhoods within the same city. So you can see with Portland, Oregon, more than a 12-degree Fahrenheit temperature difference between redline neighborhoods and the highest rated ones. And this is a common issue across the US. And there's obviously a lot of health problems that come with that. And that's not the only consequence of, having higher temperatures is just one of many consequences of having less tree canopy. So in the midst of all this, well, kind of before and during this, because my work started around, the field work was around 2015. And then all this information came out in 2020. I had already finished my PhD, but what was going on in Detroit was that you had these former redlined neighborhoods where the nonprofits started to pop up and say, we want to help get more trees in the city, we want to help the city. And so basically they started to try to plant trees, and then they kept getting these no tree requests. So this created a whole different barrier to improving the canopy, because people were resisting some of these efforts. And so what I found was, this is from the Greening of Detroit, their mission is that they aspire to provide a greener tomorrow for our Detroit. At the time I did this work, they had planted over 85,000 trees since 1989, but they were getting no tree requests from about 25% of people between 2011 and 2014, which is what they had data for. And so this really begged the question, why are people turning down trees, and what can be done to address this issue? So what I found was that community engagement, that word gets tossed around a lot, but it's important that we define it, what it means. But because a lot of what was happening in Detroit, and it happens in many places, is that community engagement focuses on persuasion. We need to educate people about why trees are so beneficial. And this is from one of the board members I interviewed, saying, we're just constantly educating people about why what we're doing is so important and what they give up by refusing a tree that we're offering. If they don't know what they're missing, they've never had those benefits, all they see is the negatives. So, and this is a document on image from the Nature Conservancy, basically portraying all these benefits of trees. And these were the kinds of things that the organization was trying to educate the community about. But from a justice perspective, what was missing here was actually figuring out first, where are people coming from? What do they already know about trees? Is the fact that they've not had a lot of trees, is that really why they are turning down trees? Or is it something else? So that's why it was important for me to go in and interview the residents as well that submitted these no tree requests. And I went in and These are pictures. You can see limbs have fallen. There's some stumps that haven't been ground down. There's another younger tree that hasn't been very well cared for. And what I found out was that the residents actually love trees. Most of them actually really love trees, including the people who submitted no tree requests. She said, this is one woman who said, I love trees actually. It makes things beautiful, it makes shade. So she's naming some of these benefits she already knows about. I love trees. There's no problem with trees. The problem with trees is they have to be maintained, and in our neighborhood, they're not being maintained. So this is again a legacy of redlining. Not only were these neighborhoods disinvested and withheld opportunities economically to buy homes at affordable rates and to then improve their economic standard, create generational wealth through property ownership and the other economic opportunities that happen when you have that investment in a community. And then so you have this disinvestment, and the city staff, the foresters that I interviewed, admitted that 2014 Detroit was going through bankruptcy, and they said we don't have the resources. We have 20,000 dead standing trees that are hazardous, probably a lot from emerald ash borer that died, and we have the resources to get rid of 2,000 a year. So that's 10% a year. So of course people are frustrated that they're having to deal with these trees that are not in good shape, right? And so there's so much going on here that we're not, now we're filling out the picture of really why people turn down trees, what they're really concerned about. This is a vacant property next to one of the people who submitted a no tree request. You can see it's quite overgrown. This is very common challenge in Detroit because the population went from 1.85 million in the 60s to just over 600,000 around the time of this study, because of white flight to the suburbs. So there's all kinds of things that happen as a result, which is that now you have these properties that are not cared for and it's left up to the neighbors to deal with it. So the people that didn't want a tree said they had greater challenges with property upkeep, fewer resources to help address these maintenance issues, and they had had disappointing results from lack of involvement in actions affecting neighborhood appearance and function. 40% of the residents I interviewed said they would have accepted a tree if they had had a choice of the species planted and or the tree was maintained. So this is where you're starting to see there's limitations. If you need to understand, right, what's the experience people have had with trees and how is that informing the way they think about tree planting and what they would need in order to accept a tree now in that context. So it's not as powerful to try to convince someone to take a tree by saying, here's all the amazing benefits. It's not to say that we don't talk about the benefits, but we need to start from what do people already know? What's already important to them? What relationship do they have and do they want to have with trees? So that's something we're going to kind of get into. I just wanted to share another example. This is from James Williams. He's a Black arborist in Atlanta, Georgia, and he works predominantly in Black communities. And he sent me these photos, and he said, Atlanta is famously known as being a city in the forest. But what happens when a large number of residents can't afford $6,000 plus tree removal services? And then he has these quotes, but they said trees is good, but not when they're past their natural lifespan in proximity to cars, homes, and businesses. So, and this is another image. You can see residents coming together with their equipment that they have to try to deal with these trees that have come down during storms. So this is really happening pretty much everywhere. There's many examples. These are just a few. And so the lessons learned, this is where I was doing this work with Arbor Day Foundation. We're going to lead into a discussion actually, and I'm going to have you get into breakout groups. So keep in mind that we're going to actually ask you to kind of explore your own heritage narratives. And so I want you to kind of keep that in mind as we talk about right now what heritage narratives are. It's actually a concept from sociology. So we can thank the fact that I had a sociologist on my committee for exposing me to this amazing framework that ended up being extremely relevant and had not yet been applied to urban and community forestry. But it's important that we, just as you saw with the nonprofit, they mean well and they're doing good work in general, but also there's some areas where they need to think more about where they're coming from and how that might be different than where the residents are coming from. So it's important to understand our own histories with trees and other people's histories with trees. So this is heritage narratives are broad renditions of a community's history, the character of its people, both past and present, and its trials and triumphs over time. So for example, Detroit is very much defined by a few key characteristics. It's the Motor City. There's a strong car legacy. Motown, the music legacy, but it's also part of where the race rebellion or race riots in 1967 happened, which were among the most violent in history in the US, which I also talk about in the book. And there's actually all these connections, and you would think, well, that doesn't have to do with trees, but it actually sometimes does. So there are ways that people's experiences with trees and the way they're managed or mismanaged can then affect how they feel about tree planting and tree stewardship at this point in time. So these stories about a community's history will emerge when you are talking to people in a community that are trying to develop a response to a new challenge. In this case, or maybe not so new challenge, but a challenge maybe they haven't engaged with yet, which is the tree canopy. So you might be coming across people in Tacoma who are new to the tree canopy work, but they will think about their own stories in the community to develop a response and to develop an idea of what they think they should do. Hopefully that makes sense. So that was one of the key lessons learned. This is also another lesson is that instead of just giving people information about the general benefits of trees, we need to be more addressing their questions that they have, again, based on their past experience and their concerns about the future. This is a lovely diagram from Tree Philly. And I love it because you can see it has a little maintenance level speedometer. So it says this tree is kind of low maintenance, which is nice to know, and tells you how tall and wide the tree will get. It also shows you like what the tree might look like next to a building after 5 years, 10 years, 30 years. And it also provides some imagery about what the different parts of the tree will look like, how much watering is necessary. So this is great because when I talked to residents, they wanted to know what's the life cycle, how big is this tree going to get, how quickly, what are the maintenance needs, what is this going to require of me, and what are the costs, and what support is available, if any, and also what are the specific benefits about different species of trees. Like some species might do well in standing water. So if you have a yard that floods frequently, you might want something that would tolerate that type of wet condition. Or if you want a smaller tree, more ornamental. And then there's, sometimes urban foresters are hesitant to give up power and let residents make choices about species to plant because they're like, well, they're going to pick all these, small little ornamentals. That's not going to help with biodiversity and all these other things. And I'm like, yes, but you can have a facilitated dialogue. You don't have to give people the choice of everything, but you can say, like, here's the parameters, and within this, what would you like? You know what I mean? There's compromise that's possible. So the last couple lessons I'm going to share before we get into our discussion, and I'll welcome any questions maybe if you have any before we get into your groups. But it's really important that we start sharing power or continue sharing power and broaden the values considered. So that, again, this is where you get to offer choice to people. And there's an example here from East Lansing, Michigan that you can look at after the webinar if you'd like. Also, it's important that we start to broaden our indicators of success. It's not just about how many trees we planted or where we planted them. It's more important that we think about asking people about their level of satisfaction, how many additional residents are actually seeking to become involved because maybe they heard their neighbor had a good experience. And then also how involved are people in stewardship over time? If you're providing some support, does that lead to more stewardship? And then ultimately, does that help with tree survival and health over time? Um, so, what I learned in Detroit was definitely people see their trees, they notice them, they observe and make note mentally of the challenges they're having. So why not, if they're already doing that, collect some of that information, monitor the tree, have the resident engaged in that process, and then help them address the issues that might emerge. So that's kind of a more engaging approach, and that can ultimately help the tree as well. So I want to pause for just a second. Are there, because the group activity is essentially going to be this worksheet or this questionnaire sheet, which you're welcome to use afterwards in your work. And the idea is that you start to explore your heritage narratives, your stories about Tacoma and the trees there, and your experiences with trees there, and how does that guide the way that you think about urban forestry now. So you won't be able to get to all of these questions, but what I would love is in this discussion for you to take about 5 to 7 minutes for each person, ask each other a few of these questions, especially the tree related questions, and try to listen to understand, not to respond.